Hello parents and professionals, and welcome to this month's video. I'm going to be sharing with you today a model that is used within biology to talk about how things evolve and how that relates to the evolution of anxiety within a child or young person. So if you want to learn 4 different ways that we can tackle anxiety from an evolutionary perspective, then just keep on watching. So the model that I'm going to be sharing with you today comes from Nikolaas Tinbergen, who created these 4 questions that are used to define how something evolves in the biological world. And the reason why I think these are quite relevant is because they help us to define and explain certain elements of animals' behaviour. And of course, human beings are animals. We're going to be looking at human beings from an animalistic perspective, because ultimately these responses and reactions that we have to things like anxiety are ultimately in part caused by the fact that we are just animals, and so we do just have these innate, natural, genetic, prehistoric tendencies within our systems that sometimes we cannot consciously overcome and require a little bit more workings in an unconscious way, or indeed with some behavioural modifications to be able to really avoid those inbuilt tendencies that might be there for us. So I'm going to be referring to my notes today because actually some of this stuff is quite new to me too, and certainly the adaptation of taking these 4 questions and fitting them into a model like anxiety, I don't think anybody's ever done that before. But when I heard these 4 questions and their definition, straight away I thought, there's something in that around how anxiety evolves and develops within an individual. So here are the 4 subject headings, if you like, and the questions that go with each of them. So first of all, we have function, then we have ontogeny, then we have phylogeny, and finally we have mechanism. So with function, the question that goes with function is, how does it help me to survive? Now, when we think about something like anxiety, it's really easy for us to consider that to be a wholly negative experience that doesn't have any good, it doesn't bring me anything. There's no positives in there. But remember that when we look at problems, certainly from an NLP perspective, we're always considering that a behaviour has a positive intention. Even if it doesn't appear to be the case on the surface, at some level, it will be meeting a need. So when it comes to the question, how does this help me to survive? Well, in some cases, having anxiety might help a young person to avoid things that they perceive as being harmful, dangerous, or troubling to them in some way. In fact, having a full-blown anxiety attack about something, even though that appears to be painful and uncomfortable and horrible, like why would anybody want that? If there is an unconscious, deep down perception that that is a better experience than the thing that anxiety has led them to avoid, for example, a social scenario or going into school that day, then actually suddenly that anxiety serves a positive purpose. It's helped them to avoid something that for them feels like it could have been harmful or dangerous to them in some way, even though logically we know that is not the case at all. Ontogeny looks at the individual development. So a good example here is something like a bird learning to sing. So like how is this useful to the bird, and how did it develop for them on an individual basis? Well, when a baby bird hears its mummy bird singing, it starts to learn the pattern of how to deliver a tune, and based on how successful the mum is at singing, it's going to have some impact on how successful their baby bird is at singing. And so there's going to be a window of opportunity for this baby bird to be able to learn those skills of being able to sing really tunefully. Just like with our children, there are windows of opportunity for them to be able to learn certain skills within their overall development. There's a window of opportunity for walking, talking, reading, and we might also notice that if for some reason those windows of development are missed, that actually they don't develop within those areas quite as well as they otherwise could have done. So one of the reasons why those developmental windows work so well for us is because when we develop that particular skill within that certain window, we often get rewarded for it, whether that is praise or connection or some kind of love or really any other kind of reward that tells us that that was a good thing for us to do. And sometimes we see with anxiety that there are rewards that happen for someone as a result of displaying that anxiety. Let's take the example of a young person who skipped school one day because they were feeling socially anxious about going in, and as a result, a parent ends up taking the day off of school and spending the day with them. Now, if the child wasn't unwell, obviously they're not going to be kind of cooped up in their bedroom, having a boring day. If they're having lots of engagement and interaction from their parent as a result of taking that day off of school from anxiety, then suddenly that can feel like a reward for them, even though it was never meant to be that way. And so this is when we start to see that actually that there is an individual layer of development then that takes place. There's an individual learning that happens for that young person that tells them, if I behave in this way, I will be rewarded for it. It might seem counterintuitive to think of anxiety as a skill even, or to think of it as being something around individual development. But again, if we see that that behaviour is in some way perceived as being rewarded, then the reason why that becomes something that our young person might gravitate towards is because as a result of noticing this behaviour in the outside world, so maybe they've seen somebody else who's behaving anxiously, they then mirror the skills so that they start to develop those skills within themselves, and they notice then that in some way they get rewarded for having that particular type of behaviour. Again, it could be love, it could be comfort, it could even be negative attention. You know, it could be a parent or a carer who says, this is terrible behaviour, don't do this, it's really annoying, but it's still attention, and so they still might then be inclined to gravitate towards it in the future. So our third and final question, not third and final, that's a lie. Our third question relating to the categories of explanation for animal behaviour is phylogeny. And this one is where something develops within a species over the course of several generations. And that is definitely something that we might see happening with anxiety. Have you ever noticed that perhaps a child that you work with who is super anxious, lo and behold, has a super anxious mum or dad as well? And it turns out that there's also a super anxious grandparent to throw into the mix. Well, that's because we not just learn generationally what we should be acting and behaving like, but there's probably also, even with something like anxiety, some genetic predisposition towards those particular behaviours. And so it could well be the case that there is a greater chance of this young person being anxious because they're carrying a little bit of genetic code which, with the right environmental factors, can easily get turned on, so that then their anxiety radar is well underway, in operation, whenever something that looks like an anxiety-provoking stimulus shows up in their world for them. So we can't entirely blame anxiety on environmental stuff that's going on, or even sort of situations that might show up on an individual level for a young person. There may actually be something to the idea of there being some genetic predisposition to this as well. And it takes us back to that age-old nature-nurture debate around which one is really affecting who we end up becoming in the world. And the answer, as is often the case, is a little bit of both nature and nurture. The tendency to become an anxious individual does, at least in part, for some, come from the genetics that they have inherited from other people who are most likely anxious people. But there is also the chance that certain things that happen in their life might cause them to either become more anxious or to become more confident and less anxious, depending on what sorts of stimuli they are then interacting with in the world around them. So our final question is around mechanism, and this pertains to how does it work? So when it comes to anxiety, we've kind of touched on this a little bit in question number 3. In terms of how it works, is going to be all of the internal processes and internal functions. What is this person's neurology set up like? What is their hormone levels like? How do they behave and communicate with themselves internally? So all of those internal processes that we do also have a factor in how anxious we may or may not show up as in the world around us. And so for our young person, what this tells us is that, again, there may be a disposition towards them behaving more anxiously if they have a neural network already set up and functioning in their brain that kicks in very quickly whenever there is an anxious trigger, that releases the hormones that cause them to get more stressed out super quickly, or because they have kind of practice and rehearse in their minds that all of what might go horribly wrong in life, so that they can very quickly behave and react to some sort of negative anxiety inducing stimuli. So here's what we're saying. As a result of looking at these 4 questions, it does give us 4 reasons why anxiety might show up for a young person. So to recap, in regards to function, it could be because having anxiety helps me to avoid bad things, therefore it keeps me safe. It could relate to individual development, so I get rewarded when I'm anxious, because I get more love and connection and praise from it. It could be down to phylogeny, so because of it coming down through generations and generations, I've kind of inherited this skill set and I've modelled it from my mum, my grandma, my great-grandma over the decades. And it can also be down to mechanism in terms of what is actually going on in the setup of that person's brain and their biochemistry, because maybe they just have a more natural tendency and inclination towards reacting and behaving anxiously. Here's the good news in all of that. Whilst there are 4 reasons why we may be inclined to become an anxious person or end up dealing with an anxious young person, it also tells us that there's 4 different ways there that we can start to tackle the issues around anxiety. So if we go back to function and, maybe this anxiety is helping me to survive in some way, we can look at some of these cognitive behavioural interventions to start changing that fundamental thinking that's going on there, and to help our young person see that actually there are other ways of being able to think about life and to be able to overcome those traumatic anxiety inducing triggers that go on in their world. When it comes to looking at, well, I individually developed this because I found it rewarding in some way, again, we've got some help that we can put in place, possibly for the people around the anxious young person in this instance. We might be looking at parents or carers who we can encourage to behave and react differently towards the anxious individual, so that whilst they can still be encouraging and supportive, they're not actually investing so much into the anxiety, but instead they put more of the emphasis and more of their love, attention and connection into when that young person behaves in the opposite way to being anxious, when they step out of their comfort zone, when they are brave about something, or when they maybe say something with confidence in a way that they might not have done so before. When it comes to our phylogeny, so this is where we're looking at the behaviours over generations. I would revert again to looking at something along the NLP CBT type approach here, because sometimes we need that help to be able to break the trend of generations. I remember one of my NLP trainers telling a story about how stuff gets passed down through the generations, and sometimes I tell this on training. Basically, you have a a daughter who is cooking a piece of ham for the Sunday dinner for her new husband. And before she puts the ham in the oven, she cuts the end off of it. And her husband says to her, why have you just like got rid of that good piece of ham, like the bit that was on the end there? What was wrong with that part? And she says, oh, you always have to cut the end off of the ham. And he's like, I don't know if that's true. Where's your source for this information? And so she said, well, that's just the way my mum did it. So then she goes to her mum and says to her mum, you know, when you cook a piece of ham, before you put it in the oven, and the mum goes, oh, you've got to cut the end off. Always cut the end off of the ham before you put it in the oven. And the daughter's like, right, I know. So my husband asked me, why do I do that? So why do we do that? And the mum says, well, that's what great-grandma did. It's just the way you cook the ham. It's the way she taught me. It's the way I've taught you. So then they go to the great-grandma and they say, how come when you cook a piece of ham, you always have to cut the end off of it before you put it into the oven? And the great-grandma says, because it's too big for the dish. Sometimes stuff just gets passed down through the generations that is no longer relevant for us. So again, by leaning on some of those cognitive behavioural NLP type techniques that we have at our disposal, we're able to start interrupting limiting patterns. So definitely that would be relevant there. And finally, we have mechanism. So this is where we're looking at the kind of physiological, biochemical, neurological, internal experiences that create anxiety. Guess what? I'm going to be leaning on NLP here too, because we know that when we get people behaving and practicing in different ways, our brains have neuroplasticity. They're able to change their physical form so that they support us in thinking and behaving in new ways going forward. But it takes a little bit of rehearsal. And so we can work with our clients and the young people that we are engaged with to help them to carve out new ways of holding their posture, new ways of calming their emotions down so that they have a bit more control over those wild hormones that might be raging through them otherwise. And as a result of doing these things, they actually start to change the form of their brain so that later, when they're exposed to those same old anxious inducing stimulations, they are already pre-wired to behave and react differently going forward. So we can use the techniques that we have at our disposal to essentially change the way human beings have evolved to be anxious and to prevent the anxiety passing down through further generations going forward. And so this is what I am challenging all of you with doing over the next few weeks and months. Maybe you need to be thinking about, how do I change to cause my child to change? Maybe you need to be thinking about, how can I stop rewarding anxiety and start to put my time, energy and focus into when I see this young person behaving confidently instead? Maybe the question is around, okay, what cognitive strategies can I share with this young person to help them have better control over negative thinking or kind of physical reactions that they might have to anxiety stimulating things that go on in their world. So just consider those 4 key points, because even though we could look at this as a negative and say, oh, we're all a bit stuck because it turns out we've just evolved to become anxious creatures, so that's just the way it is. The good thing is that all 4 of those mechanisms, those 4 key questions that I've shared with you, have an antidote, so that we're able to encourage our young people to be the best versions of themselves that they possibly can be without anxiety getting in the way quite so much. So that is everything for this month. Thank you all so much for watching and listening. If you found something useful or important in this video today, please go ahead and click the thumbs up button. Make sure that you subscribe to this channel if you're not already subscribed, and click the notifications bell. That way you'll get notified the next time you hop on YouTube and I've uploaded another video. But for now, thank you all so much for watching and listening, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!